an expert in leadership and organizational design. He's worked in a very broad and diverse and rich background across healthcare, NGOs, the corporate world, and so on. His thinking and his ideas around leadership and ecological systems and design thinking merge wonderfully and produce fascinating insights I can't wait to get into more. And I'm particularly interested in the rich background that you've had, Simon, and understanding the context that have helped to produce some of your thinking and your approaches. And I think there's lots for us all to learn here, hopefully in this conversation, around what eco-leadership is, how it might manifest and how we might be able to practice it, and the benefits that we can all experience from it, and the understanding it can give us when looking at other forms of leadership and organization and relationships. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand over to you and invite you to give us a bit of a narrative in your own words of your career to date, because I know you've had such a rich and varied career. I'm particularly interested in how you view it in terms of like particular chapters of your life and how that's affected your thinking.
Thanks, Rob. Hello, everybody, and thanks, Paul and Anna, for the invitation. Yeah, when I write books and when I start them by putting in a chapter which says what authored the author, because I think it's important that we kind of trace our ideas, where they come from. And for me, everything written is autobiography because it comes from us. But where do we come from? You know, what shaped my thinking, what shaped our thinking. So I give you a narrative of my work practice. When we talk about narratives of ourselves, but of course there's many narratives we can tell, and everyone is lacking some things, and we always leave some things out. But this narrative helps you understand where eco-leadership came from. So I go with this one. I was born in Bristol and brought up in a working class home, council estate initially, then we got our own home, and I went to a all boys school, which was not a very educationally focused place. Lots of rugby, very kind of male. You kind of had three choices when you left school. It was car mechanic, the local aerodrome factory, BAC, or the army. That was kind of like the three things they threw at us, really. And I left with, I think, 2 O levels, and I was at the age of 16. It was quite a painful kind of leaving, because one minute you're a child in a school playing childish sort of games, and next minute I had to get a job, and I got a job in a factory in Bedminster in Bristol, a paper bag making factory. And it was a formative experience. I was in the factory, and the noise of the machines still resonates with me. I can hear the rhythm of the machines. We clocked in, we clocked out. It was very old school factory, very noisy factory. Women at the end of the machines packing bags all day as if they were machines. So it was very much about manual labor, and it was you didn't go to work for any passion or any development. You went to work to earn some money for the evenings and for the weekends. That was the game. A tough working place, very tough environment. I was a gifted rugby player, and I played rugby for Bristol. And somebody at the club said to me, "Simon, you're wasting yourself at the factory. I've heard that they need male nurses at the hospital, and you're good with people. I've seen you train the youth team. You're good with people. Why don't you kind of go and be a male nurse?" And I was kind of shocked, because for me, nurses was a female, gendered kind of profession, but it sounded better than the factory. So I did a couple of O levels, and I started working as a student nurse at the age of 18. And again, a massive shock. I mean, you move from the factory into a nursing environment. And of course, the nurse works with the body, and they work with the body closer, perhaps, than any other profession in the world. You know, you work with the living body and the dying body, the resilient body and the sick body. And I saw neurosurgery, I saw legs being sawn off. I kind of was in the emergency room. I work with care of the dying, you know, and you're 18 years old. It's like it's a formidable experience, and looking back on it, I think it was my naivety which took me through. I'm glad I had very little self-awareness. If I had self-awareness, I think I would have left. But it was a very powerful experience and very moving experience. And I quickly realized that being in that kind of institution was problematic for me, because the institution was a bit army-like. Everyone had a rank, you know, the ward sisters had a rank, the matron had a rank, the consultants came into the ward and everyone walked behind them in file. There's a very kind of a hierarchical called ranking system in a hospital, and that jarred with me. It didn't kind of feel right. And the other thing I jarred with was I was told off quite a lot for talking to patients. Like I was very interested, you know, care of the dying was a big interest for me. I actually really loved nursing the dying and talking to their relatives. But that was kind of against the grain in the hospital. You know, as a nurse, you're supposed to kind of be distant, not too close to the patients, not get too involved with the patients. It was kind of shunned, that way of thinking. So I left the general hospital. I did a bit of traveling, went traveling, and came back, and I worked for a year on a women's ward in Bristol, an elderly person's ward, which I loved. And then I followed my passion, which was the psychology and the psychology of treating patients. And I went to York to study psychiatric nursing. Again, it was another big experience, because I went into psychiatric nursing just at the time when the asylums were still open and just about to close. So there was this care of the community movement, and all these asylums were being closed. And I went at the end of that kind of a period of time, and I worked in one of these great big Victorian asylums at the edge of a city with the great big walls around it. And it was a profound experience. You know, you walked onto a ward and there were 70 beds there without any curtains, without any privacy. People had been there for 30, 40 years. It was a total institution. It was quite a shocking experience, really. And the ECT was used quite a lot. Electroconvulsive therapy was used quite a lot on depression. And, you know, I met patients there who'd had postnatal depression in the 50s and had never been let out again. You know, it was really quite a place. And yet at the same time, it was there was quite a lot of caring there. There was a kind of a mix between a very caring total community and somewhere which was very harsh. It was a strange kind of mix. In that place, you really got to understand the thin line between madness and sanity. There was, you know, and how that line is quite often socially constructed, and how it changes over time, and how society puts mad people in places, kind of deposits them in these asylums out of society. So there was quite a lot of learning about the social aspects of what we call madness. And I work with people who had schizophrenia, deep psychosis, these words we throw out in everyday speech, like manic depressive, you know, but actually working with people suffering these very traumatic mental illnesses was quite awakening for me. I'm very, very sad, actually, very sad to see someone 23 with schizophrenia being tortured by voices. Stuff was very kind of painful. So I was there and I met some very educated people from university who were giving me anti-psychiatry books from R.D. Laing and from Goffman, total institutions, questioning this kind of psychiatric movement we were a part of. And I kind of fell in love with learning. It was like hugely interesting for me. Like people actually were thinking about the role of madness in society and how it's constructed. So that was really, really interesting. I left the psychiatric asylum and trained as a nurse, and I went to Liverpool to work in a therapeutic community for young people. It was the opposite to the asylum. We ran a young people center, which was a therapeutic community, which meant that we tried to give as much responsibility to the young people as we could. So they ran the community. They elected leaders. They cooked for themselves. They budgeted their funds. They gave each other feedback on their behavior. So we constructed this safe space where they could learn from each other. So rather than being treated with medicine and being individually kind of diagnosed, there was a community feel to it, and the idea was that the community could heal itself. And it was quite transformational to see what would happen to these young people from Liverpool who had been discarded, and they came to us suicidal and anorexic and often left in much better shape. It was very, very powerful learning experience. And there, a mentor kind of picked me up and saw that I was gifted, and he made me a charge nurse at a very young age. And I was leading this community at the age of kind of 22. And it was one of those experiences where someone kind of sees something in you which you don't see in yourself and says, you can do this. And it's like a huge shift for me around self-confidence and what I could do. From there, I went on a journey of studying. I did a master's degree in psychotherapy and counseling, and I became a trained psychotherapist, and then I trained as a family therapist. And I started to get interested in why the systems I was working in the hospitals, in the health sector, why they were so dysfunctional. It was very troubling to me, like why there was such poor leadership. Occasionally you meet someone who bucked the trend, someone who kind of be really just brilliant. But generally the system seemed to be acting against us. We were all very dedicated to our work, but they seemed to be acting against us. And it was, I found it very, very troubling and actually very personally painful, because you wanted to do the best for your clients, and yet you were being prevented because of bureaucratic systems. So I studied, I went to the Tavistock to study the unconscious in organizations. The Tavistock Clinic runs a course called Psychoanalysis and Organizations, about the unconscious motivations, about why organizations don't work successfully and what we could do about it. And I loved that program. I did that part-time. I was practicing as a family therapist in Liverpool at the time, working with very deprived children, young people in poverty I've never seen before, in sort of post-industrial Liverpool, 1980s, Thatcher's Liverpool. And really started to really think a lot about kind of society and the implications for these young people I was working with. I worked there for 10 years, and I was burnt out. I was like, I wasn't getting enough support. I was working with very traumatized young people. So I left and took a deep breath, and I took a risk, and I moved to Lancaster to sign up to do a PhD at Lancaster University to study leadership, because I really wanted to understand better what was going on in organizational life. I couldn't afford to do it full time, so I got a job. Professor Jonathan Gosling saw my talent. He'd marked my thesis from the Tavistock. I had a distinction, and he took me into his unit, and I became a researcher and soon became an adjunct lecturer with him. And we spent 10 years together working in executive education. Meanwhile, I was studying leadership, and it was a profound change. From one minute I was working with the poorest, disadvantaged young people you can imagine. Next minute I was flying to Gap to work with to San Francisco to work with Gap and other such executives at a very senior level. So suddenly working with kind of the disempowered and then the empowered was kind of really, really interesting and a kind of huge shift for me. But again, Jonathan was very supportive, and he kind of saw that I could deal with this, and we had a great time together, being very, very creative. And all our work was based on the idea of learning from practice, learning from experience, learning from each other, rather than the sort of top-down knowledge you get fed in much of university life. I worked with Henry Mintzberg during that time on his master's programs as well, and just a really, really interesting time. I published my thesis. It became a book, Leadership: A Critical Text, and that's in its third edition now. And since then, I've worked in that kind of executive education space. Lancaster made me the director of their coaching programs. I founded their coaching programs, postgraduate coaching programs. And since then, I've been working in that executive ed space in all sectors, in health, ed and education, in banking, I've been working with Microsoft, with Ford, many of the large organizations, and they bring me in to think about this idea I've got called eco-leadership, which we'll talk about later. But you're just kind of recap that journey. When I look back on that journey, I see a pattern there, which is repeated in the courses I teach. And the pattern goes that I work with the body in the factory as a manual laborer and the body as a nurse. I shifted to the kind of the mind in psychiatry and the individual. I realized when working with young people that you couldn't work just with the individual. They were part of a family system. So we had to really think about the family system. When I was working with the family system, I realized that you also had to work with the school and the police and the social services if you're going to get any change, get that support together. So started thinking systemically. And then in academia, I started to think about society and social change. So you've got this movement between the body and the mind, the individual and the small group, and the organization, and then social philosophy and social change. Again, and all these things are very connected, and they've all influenced me. And the work around eco-leadership comes out of that experience. So sorry for being a bit long, perhaps, but that's
No, that's great. Straight off the back of that, I'm thinking, at what point does this ecological lens come in? So at what point do you go from thinking in terms of like systems to thinking in terms of this ecological lens? What were you encountering or reading, or what did you experience in your own life that led you to move from looking at leadership and organizational structures to this ecological viewpoint?
Yeah, so that came from two directions, really. So one, I'm alongside that work role, I've been an activist all my life. So I was a young anarchist in Bristol and on every demo you can imagine, anti-apartheid and stuff, you know. I walk the mountains. I'm very in touch with nature. I've always been someone who camping, mountains, kind of walking Himalayas, you know, so that's always been part of my makeup. But I didn't put it together until I started doing the PhD. And when I did the PhD, I finished the PhD, and then I was going to write this book. I started to write this book. And at that stage, I'd written about leadership over the last century. And I'd done an analysis of leadership. And it's in my book. And I categorize leadership in three ways. So we talk about leadership 100 years ago, and we think about controller leadership. And this is from the factory where, you know, workers are closely supervised, their resources, and we work in a kind of machinic way. And it's all about efficiency, Taylorism and efficiency drives. And that informs controller leadership. In the 60s, there was a shift to kind of what I call therapist leadership. And therapist leadership is really about kind of people, happier workers, more productive worker. Psychologists came into the workplace. So there's this real kind of shift towards kind of people focused. How can we maximize the potential and motivate individuals and teams? So that was therapist leadership. There was a third category, which was Messiah leadership. And that was the big shift in the 1980s, where leadership started to become a mainstream thing to talk about, leadership and culture in organizations. And Messiah leaders were kind of brought in to create these vision statements. I don't remember, suddenly we flipped into vision statements, and transformational leaders and CEO salaries went through the roof. And Steve Jobs came on the scene, and it said these very charismatic leaders that came about. So you shifted from controller to therapist to Messiah, and they didn't replace each other. You know, you need all three. You need people to kind of focus on data and efficiency and stuff. You need good people managers, and you need some vision, but they get out of balance. They get very, very out of balance. So I'm writing my book, and I'm writing about these approaches. And I was in America, and I took some time out of Lancaster University, and I decided to study some modules in theology. I was kind of interested in spirituality and theology. So I went to Berkeley, California, and I studied there. And I took a road trip, and I did this amazing road trip, and I ended up in a hermitage in Big Sur. It was like just one of those things. You're driving past the most beautiful landscapes you can ever imagine, and there's a signpost saying Hermitage, and I think, yes, that's a calling. So I follow the sign up to the Hermitage, and I camp outside the Hermitage, and the monk there kind of came out of the gates and saw my tent and said, you know, come and join us, you know, come and stay with us for a while. So I did, and I'm sat in this most amazing Hermitage, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life, going through the rhythms of prayer, writing my book, and I'm trying to think what is the next leadership after Messiah leadership. You know, what comes next? And the word ecology, the environmental movement was picking up. There was this kind of this language, ecosystems was starting to be used. This is probably 15 years ago now, and it started to become a bit more mainstream. And I looked around this monastery and the way of the monks' life, how monks were formed, going through this holistic formation. I kind of write in my book, you don't train monks in monk skills. Monks are formed by the holistic system. And I started to think in an ecological framework, and that's where eco-leadership came from in that monastery, and reflecting on kind of how close they were to nature and the rhythm of life. And it all started to come together, and that's where it started.
To what extent do you think that ecological perspective is a different type of, like, how different is it to the more mechanistic, linear? You talked about factories earlier, you talked about control and so on. To what extent do you think that this particular approach in itself, this ecological perspective, how significant is that shift, that difference in terms of thinking? Like, I'm hesitating to use the word paradigm, but it does feel like that to me, but I want you to use your own words. To what extent is it an important or historical shift?
It's massive. It's absolutely a paradigm shift. And it's, you know, people bring me in to talk about eco-leadership, and they kind of like the idea that when I started talking about eco-leadership, people thought it was very marginal and a bit kind of wacky and a bit tree huggy kind of idea. And then it became more mainstream, and you got everybody now, like, you know, you got Microsoft talking about the ecosystems, their business ecosystems, their financial ecosystems. So it's become mainstream, but actually working in organizations to try and get organizations to shift into that paradigm is very, very difficult. It's like they get some of it conceptually. People throw out words like complexity or systems, but this ecological mindset is really, really difficult. It's very counterintuitive to the modernist mindset. The modernist mindset really entraps us. Even when we want to think in ecological mindsets, even I slip back quite a lot, because that's how we're so conditioned. Everything around us conditions us to this machine mindset, this mechanistic mindset, and it's a real struggle, you know. And people who haven't really done enough work find it very difficult, and they slip back, you know. So people come to me for eco leadership, and they very quickly slip back to Messiah, therapist, or controller leadership, and under pressure, without noticing it at an unconscious level, because it's such a big shift.
Try and concretize that just a little bit. One of the things that comes to my mind about thinking about, you know, because what we're talking about at a paradigm level is like so upstream that the downstream beliefs have to change. The whole way of looking at things has to be different. One of the things that I like to think about when I'm thinking in terms of systems and ecologies is rather than trying to achieve a specific outcome, asking myself the question, what sort of conditions could I create that are conducive to the type of outcome that I want?
Yeah.
How does that fit with your view? And like, what are you telling people in terms of, or not telling, but how are you helping people to approach things differently, to see things differently, and to participate differently through this sort of like ecological lens?
So, I mean, I work kind of at different levels. So we work conceptually. So first, people do need some conceptual ideas to kind of hang this on. Secondly, I work with a psychoanalytic, emotional kind of lens, because we become very unconsciously invested and attached to certain ways of being. You know, we like to think we want to change, but actually unconsciously we're very attached to kind of and we will defend our attachments with everything we got, you know. So you have to kind of hold that in mind when you work. So like, I run a coaching program and I run leadership programs, and I've learned that you have to take people on a journey. So the journey I take people on is I take them through 5 frames, and these frames aren't fixed or static, but they're just helpful frames to take you on a journey. And it's similar to my own journey. So we do a depth analysis where we look at our own assumptions, we look at our own insights, we look at our own defenses, we look at our own desires, you know, we look at kind of what purpose we want. So we do this kind of inner self depth journey with people first. We then go into a relational analysis. like, how do you relate to others? How do others relate to you? How does that kind of shape you? It's not just how you communicate to others, but actually, how you've been brought up, how you kind of relate to authority figures, how they relate to you really shapes kind of how you are. And so people start thinking a bit more connectedly. We then do a leadership analysis, which is giving people frames. So the controller, therapist, messiah, eco-leadership. So like, it's just helping a shared language to think about where you are. These aren't static frames and there's things outside there, but we say leadership can be many things, and try and think about kind of where you recognize yourself there, where you recognize others there, what would be kind of good for you in your organization, how you balance these forms of leadership. So we do depth analysis, inner self, relational analysis, outer self, how you relate to others, leadership analysis, how you take up leadership and followership. And then we do ecosystem analysis. And then we do ecosystem mapping. So we get people to kind of map their ecosystems and start thinking more spatially, more connectedly. So for me, it's very much about putting people in their ecosystems. If you think about trying to get people to be abstract out there and think about ecosystems, it doesn't lead to much change. But if you get people to think about their assumptions, their relationships, how they relate to kind of leadership and followership, and then how they influence ecosystems and how the ecosystems influence them, they go on a journey. And by the end of the journey, they've started to kind of do some work. And I think it takes that kind of journey to get people engaged. You can't jump straight into it, I don't think.
To what extent is that journey transformational?
I call it formational rather than transformational. I think transformational is overused. So I think like every kind of coaching marketing person puts transformational on top. So I try and stand back from, and I go back to this monastic formation, this idea that we get formed by, I don't claim that Simon Weston's coaching course can transform you. I claim that people have gone through much formation when they come to me. They will go through much formation after me. And this is part of that formation process. So you're formed by your experiences, and we try and structure those experiences a bit to move you into this new paradigm.
Like that. And then within eco-leadership, I've seen you writing about 4 different qualities of eco-leadership. Can you just explain those a little bit, please?
If I can remember them, Rob.
Or the ones there's one that comes to mind I want to talk to you about in particular, but yeah, go for it.
I mean, I talk about 3 practices. So the 3 practices of eco-leadership are social purpose. So organizations need to shift from being closed systems where they just make a profit or they just kind of deal with healthcare to understand how they are a part of the wider society. So in the 4 qualities, that's organizational belonging. It's like you belong to society, you belong to the planet. For quite a few years now, we've had this pretense where organizations are separate and cut off. Particularly commercial organizations, that they go and make their profits and they have offshore kind of banking and stuff. So they lose that kind of, in Victorian days and there was organizations good and bad, but there was a kind of a location. You were located in Birmingham if you were a Quaker chocolate factory, and your philanthropy kind of went to the workers there. There's a belonging there, a sense of belonging. Whereas recently that's been detached. So having a social purpose and belonging to kind of the wider environment, wider society, local and global, is important. The second thing we talk about is participative organizations. So shifting this idea of top down to really understanding that leadership can be everywhere. We should distribute leadership. To be a successful organization, you need to really harness the talents and the potential of all in the organization. And that means allowing people to participate fully. That's not to kind of try and create some fantasy of a leader-less organization. There will be kind of leaders, but it's to understand that top-down change is not going to lead to kind of radical change. Change comes from the edges. Leadership comes from the edges. And the third is to develop eco mindsets. So this is the thing about the paradigm change. This is why we take people on a journey to try and develop these eco mindsets so that people can start to think differently. Yeah, that's a kind of the practices that I've been referring to. What were you thinking about, Rob? What was kind of your?
Well, there's a couple of things just that I wanted to pick up on, which is like this eco mindset, just making sure that I've got an understanding of what that is, and then also understanding what it would look and feel like to participate within one of these organizations that's embedded eco-leadership? Like, what would that be like if I was to show up at work one day and I'd somehow been like transported into a different organization?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a utopian, and I don't kind of paint the idea that I've got the blueprint for the perfect organization. You know, some people do. Some people kind of write these books and say this is what it looks like. It's all flattened hierarchy and all work perfectly. You know, I don't agree. I think in any democracy, in any democratic organization, in any participative organization, there's going to be tensions, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be power struggles, you know, and it's about being more transparent, about working those differences rather than trying to eliminate those differences. I do talk about leadership spirit as one of the qualities of eco-leadership, because a lot of systems and complexities theories, they miss out the kind of the deeply human part of ourselves. And when I say human, I don't just kind of mean us as separate from non-humans, but human in terms of like we are part of nature, we are part of the ecology, and many kind of systems thinking go into some sort of scientific language, and they talk about communication feedback loops, and you get lost in these clever words. I'm sure that they're useful, but they miss out the kind of the deeply humanness of our existence. And so leadership spirit to me is really, you know, when I'm a coach in my work, I talk a lot about spirits and spirituality, not imposing any views, but allowing the other to think about their own spirituality, their own journey. And that can be like from a very humanistic perspective, or it can be kind of from a religious perspective. It can be from anywhere, but just to be in touch with what that means to them, really to harness that.
That's exactly where I wanted to go. That's
Okay.
what I wanted. That's what resonated, and I wanted to pull into the conversation to a certain extent. And it's there also in that connection you mentioned already to the hermitage that you went by, the theology, and I like that you bring that in, because it's that aspect of subjectivity, of awareness and of consciousness that gets lost when we're just looking at the material or the the diagrammatic understandings of systems, rather than the fundamental foundational context that everything is taking place within. So yeah, I just wanted to get a little bit of a feel for where's that come for you? What were your experiences? Because I think I previously heard that you were atheist or even agnostic, and then finding Quakers. And where does this spirit, what was that journey like for you? Where did that come from?
Well, as an anarchist, and I was reading Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism and Nietzsche and the death of God, and trying to sort of make sense of the world. I mean, my mother was inspired by, let's say, social Christians. She was very poor, left the northern kind of land of Crewe, landed up in the East End of London, and was taken care of by some very working class Christian women. They kind of they took hold of her, and they managed to get her into kind of an education college, and she became a teacher. And she's always been very my mother was always very, she wasn't deeply religious, going to church or anything. She went occasionally, and we didn't grow up in a church household, but she was always had a sort of a background faith which informed her social practice. She came from a place of deep spirituality, but it wasn't like worn heavily. It was interesting. So I had that influence in me. But I mean, I don't know. I somehow, when I was an atheist exploring these ideas of kind of no God, I mean, I felt pretty empty, you know. I found myself, I traveled an awful lot when I was young. I loved traveling, been all over the world, and I'd be in every mosque, every Hindu temple, every church, in the forest, in pagan sites, you know, wherever there's something related to spirituality, I'd be there. And I drive my friends nuts. They'd like, come on, we want to go to the bar. And I'm like, no, I want to go to the cathedral. And like, I was just drawn to holy places, you know. So like on my journey, when I was at Glastonbury Festival back in the day, is like, you know, I'd be hanging out with the Krishnas when my friends were down listening to the big bands, you know. I'd be kind of just really interested. So something within me, I don't know what it is, kind of took me to these spiritual places. And I Quakers are great because I went to a Quaker meeting really to get, I was a single parent at home. One of the bits I missed out of the story, I was a single parent for 4 years at home with a child at the age of 26. And I went for free biscuits and tea. The Quakers would hand out free biscuits and tea, but I started reading their posters, and nobody ever kind of came to evangelize to me or proselytize, tell me kind of what I should believe. And it was a nice way in for me. And then I started reading the radical history of the Quakers, and I'm like, wow, these people have got something. And then I started to attend Quaker meetings, and the spirit moved me. One day I found myself standing up in a Quaker meeting, kind of talking or preaching, as they say, speaking, God speaking through me, would be their language. And I just became a member, and for 10 years I was quite an active member of Quakers, and now I'm in Galway. There's not a Quaker meeting locally, but I go to the local church, and I spend time there lighting candles and listening to beautiful music, and not listening too much to the sermons, but just kind of doing my thing, just like finding my spiritual space there, hanging out. So that's the journey I've been on. And I mean, I don't know what to say. I lost my son. I brought up. I lost him in a very sad, sort of tragic way, and just that faith has been very powerful to me. But again, I'm a bit like my mother. I don't kind of lead with that faith, or kind of feel. And I still go to the Krishnas, and I still go. Every time I'm in London, I go to Soho and I hang out with the Krishnas still, and they're very good to me. And I'm happy to hang out in the mosques and wherever that sense is, or the forests. Kind of, it feeds me, feeds my soul.
Thank you for sharing that. Just to tie a couple of things together there, I wanted to talk to you about two things. Maybe we could do them at the same time. I wanted to talk to you about nested holes. So your take on the relationship between the individual, the group, the social and the cultural, and how they interrelate, especially like the making of meaning. And then as an extension of that, I'm also interested in your thoughts on, the role of the individual and the collective, and how quite often change, trauma, as an individual or as a collective, as we're seeing with like the meta crisis and so on, can also be catalyst for growth and learning and development. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on those interrelationships between the nested holes, and then that potential process of growth and development, both as individuals and as a collective.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've drifted. I think modernity, the Enlightenment, I think it pushed us very much into this individualistic kind of space, and I think we need to traverse a fantasy that we're in control of everything, that we can choose our own path, because the social speaks through us. Simon Weston speaks with the background I gave you, but that's it's very kind of particular background from Bristol, from the UK, from, it's, if I was born in India in a different background, it would be a different story I'd be telling, and a different sense of understanding. And yet there might be huge overlaps. So for me, I mean, when I was studying critical theory in Lancaster Management School, there's a lot of people really diss sort of individualistic leadership and say, no, we need to throw it out, and we have to think about just leadership more collectively. And I'm like, no, individuals do have agency. We do have agency. We do have power to change things, and yet that power is always has to be kind of seen through the lens and the prism of our social upbringing, our unconscious. The social speaks through us all the time. I can't speak without being a Bristol working class boy and still feeling a bit of an imposter when I'm doing these kind of things. It's always there with you. We all have our own histories, whether you're a woman, whether your gendered self, your cultural self. So for me, these things are just entangled. There's an entanglement. I talk about how we work in organizations and organizations work in us. So organizational cultures affect you. When I was in the asylum, it affected me. When I was in the hospital, it affected me. They become part of you, or you become a resistant agent within them. But they do affect you. They impact on you. So for me, these things are. I like the word entanglement because it kind of describes how we are. So there's not a separation. There's just this entanglement and this interdependency between us and the other, us and the human and the non-human. Yeah,
and then from that perspective, that whole notion of separation disappears.
yes, yeah,
It's just one, emerging, unfolding process of relationship.